We've been working a lot with creating new entities and storing this information in the database. And the information that we end up storing is actually content. And it'd be nice if we could save revisions of that content as well. If you've worked with the node system before, and you've enabled revisions there, you can see that every time you save a node, it creates a new version of that node. And you can roll back to previous versions. You can see how a piece of content has changed over time. The Entity API supports this concept of things being revisionable. So we're going to look at the changes that are necessary in our hook entity info in order to make this work. We're also going to look at the controller provided by the Entity API that assists in making things revisionable. And then we'll talk about some of the other aspects that you need to program on your own for the whole system to work. So let's get started and make our entity revisionable. The first thing we're going to need to do to make our video entity versionable is update the schema that we're using to store information. If I take a look at our .install file, what I'd like to do is split this embed code and duration column into a table of their own, so that every time somebody updates a video entity, we can save a new copy of that data, a new row in the table. A good example of this in core is the way that Node handles revisions. If you take a look at these two tables, the Node table and the Node revision table, this is the structure that we're going to attempt to emulate. The Node table has our node ID, which is the primary key and unique ID for this node entity, and then it has a version ID. In the node table, the VID that's stored here is the current version of the node. Then if you look in the node revision table, we've got these columns, NID and VID, but what you'll often see is that there are multiple VID rows for a single NID. That's each revision of that particular node is saved. The VID refers to the revision. When somebody loads this node, it uses the VID column from the node table to figure out which row from the revision table to join in order to get the most current or default version of that entity's information. So we want to emulate that structure. That means we need to create a second table. So I'm going to create a new table, and we'll name it video entity video revision. And we'll use it to store video entity revisions, like so. And we'll add some fields to this. The first thing I'm going to do is actually just grab the duration field and the embed code field from our previous table and place those into our new table, like so. That information is just going to be stored there from now on. And then I also need to I need to have an ID field in our revisions table, and then we need to add this revision ID as well. So in our revision table, I'm going to add an ID field that is almost the same as the one in the base table here. It's just an ID, we can use the same description, unsigned, not null. The difference is I'm going to make this an integer instead of a serial field. Serial implies MySQL's auto increment. It means that every time somebody inserts a new record into the database, it's going to automatically increment that field +1. But I don't want that in this case. I just want to store the foreign key. I also need to have a revision ID column. So let's add that field. We'll add a new revision ID field. The revision ID in the revision table is going to be a field of type serial, just like the ID in the base table. And then I also need to add this revision ID field to our base table. When I do that, this time around, it's going to be a simple integer field. So here the revision ID is a field that is an integer. It's storing the foreign key. So the primary key in our base table is the ID. The primary key in our revision table is the revision ID, but they each have a column with the same name referencing that field in the other table. We can also add a primary key here to our revision table, like so. All right. So now we've got two tables, one to store the revision information and one to store the base information. And we moved a couple of columns, the ones that we would like to keep revisions for, embed code and duration, to this other table. In order to get our Drupal site to install that new table, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and uninstall our video entity module. So I'll disable it. I will uninstall it so that my tables get cleaned up, like so. And now I can install the module. I have to do this in 2 steps because I need to actually uninstall it so that when I enable it this time, it's going to run our install operations again and create the tables defined in hook schema. Now with the module installed, when I look at our database, I should see that we've got a video entity video table and a video entity video revision table. Awesome. The next thing I need to do is actually tell the entity API to make use of that. This is just a couple of easy changes that we can make. And now in our module, inside of our implementation of hook entity info, we need to tell the entity API about the table in which we're storing those duration and embed code fields, our revision table. And we can do that by adding a revision table key and giving it the name of our table, like so. The other thing that I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to, under entity keys here, tell it the property on our entity that stores the revision ID. And I do that like so. I add the key of revision, and then I set its value to revision ID, which is the property of the field in our tables that now contains that new revision ID. After I do that, I need to clear the cache on our site so that when we go to create a new entity, it's read in the new information from that implementation of hook entity info. So we'll clear the cache. Okay. And then finally, I need to update our code in one more place. If you remember in a previous lesson, we wrote some code that overrode the entity API controller by creating this video entity controller. And what that did was allow us to perform different operations like, say, save, when somebody calls the save method on our entity. We used it earlier to automatically update the created at and updated at fields. I need to do something here in order to tell the entity API that when somebody saves a video entity, they should save a new record in the revision table instead of updating the existing record. And I can do that by typing this and setting the isNewRevision key to true. In our example, we're just going to set it to always save new revisions, no matter what somebody does. However, you could, in the case of like the node module, for example, have this be a checkbox that when somebody checks the save new revision checkbox, it saves a new revision. If they leave it unchecked, it upgrades or updates the existing data. All right, let's see this in action. So if I switch over to our site, I'm going to create a new video entity. You'll remember that all of our old ones were removed when we reinstalled the module. We'll create an example video. We'll put in an embed code. We'll just give it a made up duration and put it in the kittens category. And I can save that. Saves just like before. I can view it. So far, everything looks the same. The big difference is, if we take a look at the database, in our video entity video table, you can see we've got our new entity created. And then in the revision table, you can see one row which maps to the ID of the entity, the current revision ID. Here's the embed code and the duration. Now watch what happens if we edit this. I can go and edit this example video that we just created. And let's say change its duration to something else. Update it just fine. I can still view it just fine. However, if I look at the information here, you see two rows, one with the old duration and one with the new duration. And the module is loading this version automatically, the most recent one, because of the fact that this revision ID 2 was updated in the base table as well, telling it to use the default revision ID. Cool. So let's complete this picture by writing a quick little code that will allow us to view older versions of our entity as well. Unfortunately, the API doesn't provide us this UI by default. Similar to what we've seen with a lot of the other UIs, it can't really infer this is exactly what you'd like to do, so it leaves it to us to write that. It's pretty easy though. What we'll do is we'll add a new router item to our hook menu implementation. It looks like this. So I'm going to create a new item that is at video entity slash video entity ID slash % or wildcard. So what this is going to do is call our video entity underscore load function and pass in the by default ID from here to that function. I'm going to use load arguments key in our menu item to tell it to use the number that's in this third position here instead. So that's what this line does. Then I can update our implementation of video entity load to add a second key, like so. So when somebody visits our new menu item, what will happen is this function gets called, but it's going to pass in the revision ID here. And then we can just alter the code and do something like if there's a revision ID, do this. If there's not, do this. And we're going to use a function built into the video or the entity module, which is entity revision load. It's a helper function, and what it does is essentially the same thing as entity load, but I can pass in a revision ID instead of the entity ID itself. Its signature is a little bit different. You'll notice we can only pass in a single revision ID versus the entity load function takes multiple IDs, which is why I can just return this video object directly rather than having to use this array pop construct. But that'll work. Finally, we can implement our video entity view revision page function. So we'll add a new callback for that. I can scroll down. We'll add it right in line with our existing video entity view entity. And the code for that will look something like this. So here's our callback function. What I'm actually doing is just calling our original video entity view function to get the output and display it on the page. And then I'm just calling Drupal set title to change the title that's set so that it includes revision and the revision ID. And then return that output. I should probably actually convert this to a translated string. So we'll say title revision. That way our output is both translatable and it's sanitized, since we actually have no idea what somebody could have entered into the value of this name property here. So all of that done. And now I go back. I need to clear the cache so that it picks up our changes to the hook menu implementation. And now I should be able to go and I can view a video like so. But if I wanted to view a specific revision of this video, I could do so by navigating to the appropriate path, like so. Still viewing the video, but I am viewing a different revision. Oh, we need to change this so that it's showing the revision ID instead of the actual no video ID, which would be like so. There we go. So I'm viewing revision 1, which shows this as being 20 minutes and 34 seconds. Or I could go to revision 2. Same thing, except for our time is now showing 1 day and 10 hours. So you're seeing the two different revisions. The next step would be to use something like entity field query to create a table on, say, a separate tab that listed all the revisions with links for you to navigate between one and another. But you start to get the idea of how you could pretty easily craft a UI for this as well. I'll leave the rest of it as an exercise for you to figure out. So the steps for creating revisionable entities: update your schema so that the fields that you would like to be able to save revisions of live in a separate table from your base table. Then, modify your module and your implementation of hook entity info and add in a revision table key and tell it which property on your entity contains the revision ID. Finally, make sure that in your controller, you override the save method and set isNewRevision equal to true so that it saves new revisions. And that's all you need to do.